Welcome to Eventual Consistency. I'm Ross. My guest is Mickey Peters, former energy executive and Vistage Chair. Every week, there's another announcement about AI breakthroughs, another data center project, another promise about what's possible with enough compute. We're not here for that. We're here to talk about what's actually happening, honestly, the way you'd talk about it with your team. Today on the podcast, Silicon Valley is building shadow power grids because the public grid can't keep up with AI's appetite for electricity. Cities are imposing data center moratoriums. Power, not capital or technology, is becoming the constraint that limits what you can actually build. So let's talk about what that means for anyone planning to build with AI. All right, so two stories are converging that most data leaders aren't paying attention to yet. First, the Washington Post ran an investigation that found data center operators are building private on-site power generation to bypass grid constraints. One West Texas project is consuming more power than all of Chicago. Silicon Valley is essentially building its own power infrastructure rather than waiting for the grid to catch up. Second, cities like Denver are imposing data center moratoriums, while regulators draft zoning frameworks. The bottleneck isn't capital, it's not technology, it's whether power even exists where you need it, and whether communities will let you build there. This matters because if you're planning data infrastructure, whether you're a VP of data deciding where to run workloads or a CTO planning your cloud strategy, you're probably thinking about compute costs and latency. You're probably not thinking about whether the electricity exists to power what you're planning to build, or whether electricity costs might drive your decision about whether or not to build it. Mickey ran major power operations for Duke Energy in Brazil and Peru, managing over $1 billion in capital employed. He's navigated power constraints, infrastructure buildouts, and regulatory environments. Now he advises CEOs through Vistage. Yeah, so on the subject of energy, we've got like three things happening all at once. First of all, we've got the national grid reaching its capacity, and all of these new data centers being built that are demanding a lot of energy from that grid that's reaching its capacity. And then, so as a result, you've got tech companies that are creating, a shadow power grid, like trying to generate their own energy, in tandem with the data centers. And then you've also got communities pushing back on the development of data centers because of sort of the energy dynamics around that. So, Mickey, excited to have you here, given all of your experience in the energy industry. Just interested in, what do you think about when you see these dynamics at play, with the constraints on supply and the pushing of demand for energy?
Yeah, thank you, Ross. So most of my experience was in South America, and I ran power companies in all over South America. And the projects we dealt with at that time were big mining projects. And so they were very similar. They took up big spaces in the mountains, primarily in the Andes, really had a big impact on the community. So a lot of conversations with the community, and then how we're going to get the power there. Sometimes you had to build on-site generate. It was very similar profile to what you're seeing with the data centers, but the data centers obviously at a much larger scale. And I think but it feels like there was always a lot of excitement, a lot of energy initially with the first few mining projects, but then over time the community kind of gets burned out. They realize the cost associated with the projects. Like a data center, you have a lot of employees when you're building it, but then once it's completed, there are not so many, but much fewer employees, obviously, once they have the data center in operation. And so the local impact is primarily property taxes and an influx of construction workers when you're building the project, but also there's an impact with the noise, with the fans, and so they're either saying no. I think South Bend, Indiana, recently rejected they have an existing data center that I think is nearing completion, and they had a new one, I think a bigger one, that they said no to. They actually voted down in the local government. And then Denver, I think Colorado has hit pause, said, well, right now we're going to hit pause. We're going to step back and we're going to kind of assess, which is, again, makes sense. You start to see how these things, once you have them up and running, how they work and what the impacts are. But on the grid, you said there are different responses. I find it really interesting. Meta last year just announced in Louisiana, they acquired a very large tract of land, 1,700 football fields, just to, you can all kind of get that dimension. and they're building a very large data center. Initially 2 gigawatts, eventually 5, and down the road 10. And made a deal with the Louisiana government for the local utility to build out the power, mostly gas, some solar, and it will, to give you an idea, once the initial phase is up and running, it will consume 2 times the amount of energy of the city of New Orleans at the peak of their demand. So again, the dimensions of these are just beyond or familiar with. And then you have Google just in December acquired Intersect, which was a developer of solar, primarily solar, but other renewables together with battery. And so then now they have their own in-house power developer, basically, for them to then lean on for their projects, but behind the meter. So as you said, developing their own power, not power grid, but their own power source that is interconnected to the grid, but they have their own source locally on site for their data centers. And then Microsoft and Anthropic and their recent projects are saying, okay, we'll bear the cost, telling with the utilities and the local communities, any negative cost impacts, we'll pay for those, higher rates or whatever those are. And so, Microsoft, even going back, this was a year and a half ago, where they brought 3 Mile Island out of the mothballs. That's a little under 1,000 megawatts, and they got a big loan from the Department of Energy. And so, wow, whoever thought you'd bring 3 Mile Island, out of retirement. So they're all taking different approaches, and I think it'd be interesting to see how it plays out over time, because it's not stopping. It's going to keep going, keep growing.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Given that you now sort of advise executives with Vistage, I'm just interested in, from your perspective, how are the hyperscalers, Amazon, Google, Meta, how are they all thinking, Microsoft, how are they all thinking about what the options are to procure energy for the data centers? So, when would it make sense to do your own generation on site next to the data center? When would it make sense to partner with a local utility? And sort of like, how do they think about sort of the trade-offs of these decisions?
Well, I think it's all basically cost based. They look at, there was a rush to find the perfect sites of the elements of power, land, and infrastructure, employees. You started to find these hubs, if you will, where you had this, rush to identify where are those sites where you have those elements at a reasonable cost. And then obviously over time, those sites run out. Okay, we pretty much have milked all of those, low hanging fruit, let's call them. And then it becomes a matter of, okay, where do we have community support? Because if you're going to spend millions of dollars, like in South Bend, where they spent probably tens of millions of dollars, working that project, and all of a sudden you get shut down, that's just sunk cost, right? You've wasted money. And so you really need that community support element. And so finding where those pockets are. But then, ideally, this isn't their core. They want to outsource that, right? They don't want to be in the power business. But you see Google, where they actually brought a power developer in-house. They're thinking they're going to, in their announcement, they're going to continue to run them as an independent, sort of on their own, but part of Google now. But we'll see how that plays out. But I think each one of them is, Meta obviously found did a little competition, and Louisiana won. We'll see over time if how that goes. But they actually had a very large piece of land that they had already acquired the state for an auto plant that didn't happen. So they had it sitting there, and it was what Meta was looking for, plus a lot of natural gas. They have the resource, natural gas. Natural gas power plants are relatively quick and easy to install. They're also 24/7, 365 type supply. And so they were able to, but even Google probably they have the environmental impact. Some, well, I don't want gas, I want renewables. So it's I think each company has their own different set of values and different set of priorities. And based on those, they do their research and probably have a war room with a ranking of their options. live, depending on what's happening with the value of land, the price of electricity, so then they can start to, as they monitor those, start to move on the ones that have the highest score, for the different parameters that they're looking at. But there's really no one size fits all solution. I think now it's really, each company is finding their own, what they're comfortable with their values and their strategies, and then moving forward with those options, which are very different. You see what's happening now. They're very distinct ways to solve that problem.
Yeah, no, that makes a lot of sense. I also think one of the things that seems to be getting lost is, all of these companies feel sort of the existential threat of AI, and the overwhelming framework that they're using to evaluate the quality of the AI that they can produce is the level of scale that they can get to from a data center perspective. So it's a sort of gold rush dynamic where all of these companies are rushing to deploy as much data center capacity as quickly as they can so that they can support all of the emerging use cases for AI and also support the foundation model companies that are trying to that train these bigger and bigger and bigger models. And so you've got it, and so you've got this AI market that's moving very quickly, that's moving as quickly as you can possibly move. And then you've got the energy industry, as I understand it, and would love just your understanding here. It depending on the options that you choose, it can take a long time to deploy this energy capacity. So I'm just interested in, from your perspective, for the companies that are how do they think about that trade-off between sort of the scale that they want to get to, the way that they want to be integrated into the energy infrastructure, and the speed with which they want to move in procuring the energy.
Well, and one of the biggest factors always was licensing and getting all the permits and licenses. Remember the NIMBY, not in my backyard. And so some regions have that type of a mindset. That case of Meta in Louisiana, they were able to get this. So you have the state, which controls a lot of the regulatory bodies, and so then they'll expedite the licensing process, make it quicker for them to get through that. So then the time to get it online is shorter and have the natural gas really literally there within the state parameters again. So it's all in-house versus that was always the big uncertainty, was how long will it take to go through the community aspect and have the conversations with all the community? How long would then you get comments and you have to respond to the comments? And so that's many times it would take the time. But now even so going through that, if you can find a place where you can shorten that and get the support of the community already resolved, if you will, so you don't have that uncertainty. And then you have the now shortages of equipment, which are also, shortage of transformers, breakers, etc. So those are very long lead items that are also impacting it. So maybe, the thing about you've seen is their willingness to with the money is not the issue, right? Obviously, they have plenty of financial resources, but so you really have to come at it from a creative perspective, and really, I think the biggest challenge is really that community support. That you really have to feel comfortable that you're not going to get a no, 6 or 9 months, a year into the process and go, wow, we just wasted a year. Money, but all more importantly, the time, as you said, if you're not getting those data centers online, then you got to, so maybe even doing multiple sites, which then, if a local utility is going to build out the infrastructure and then the data center, oh, we didn't choose your site, we chose another one. So they built, they committed to this infrastructure, whether it's transmission lines or switch yards or whatever. And so it's really interesting to see the dynamics, and as people get more familiar with how this works, how does this work? And then you have, as you said, the companies are, my God, we got to get these data centers on as quickly as possible. But the communities, what they're remembering is trade. Remember, trade was going to lift everybody's boats together, global trade and NAFTA and all of these agreements. And they didn't necessarily, a lot of communities did not see that. So here we are now with AI, where obviously the concerns from the people on the ground in those communities is what if the AI takes my job or my kids' jobs or my grandkids' jobs? So they're wary of the AI. So they're coming at it from exactly that's what happened in South Bend, from what I understand. What I've heard is that concern of we're basically contributing to our own demise was the thinking. Why are we doing this? You heard a lot of people asking that question, which again, education, getting everybody aware of what's in the right now. Obviously, in the I world, there's not a party line. Let's say it's very depending on who you talk to on what day, you're going to get a different perspective.
Right, and it's a very fast-moving marketplace, and these communities are, they're seeing the hype, they're seeing the big headlines that AI is coming to take their jobs, but then there's also, you mentioned in your experience in Latin America, sort of the long-term experience that people got with energy infrastructure being developed, and the way that they sort of learned the economic dynamics of how this energy infrastructure moves through their community. So I'm just interested in, from your perspective, like what do those conversations look like between a hyperscaler, a local utility, a state regulator, a local community? What does each group care about, and like where are they? What does the push and pull sort of look like in those conversations?
Normally, you have somebody, in this case, the Google or the Meta coming in from California, right? All of a sudden, which could be many people consider a foreign country. It's not, but especially in Louisiana or Texas or vice versa. But so then they come in and they've got all the numbers and the data, and they're presenting their case. So there's always suspicion, right? You're dealing with slick urban versus many times rural or small town. So you have these different dynamics, and so you really have to be well thought out, prepared, and have their arguments understood and addressed. And so they can quickly devolve into an us versus them, and outsider versus insider, and those kind of things quickly. That's really what derails it. Basically people working with half information or no information, just gossip and rumors and that sort of thing. And so you really have to take control of the narrative and really be clear and sincere, and not talk down to people, not be condescending. How you show up and how you present your case, and how you interact with the locals and make them feel like they're important to you. You want to consider their opinions. You want to even how you treat them at the meeting. You shake their hand. You show you care. Those sorts of things. If you come in and a bunch of black Suburbans, you're all in. I mean, I've actually, guys, I remember going into a small community. Everybody take off their suit and tie and their coat, roll up your sleeves. We need to ditch this, American executive thing. So just, it's really interesting how quickly, because really, if the local community isn't supporting you, it's not going to happen. And so that's really important. The regulator, it's, more of a, usually more of a peer-to-peer type of conversation. So it is about the data and about the research and about the case you're making to support your project. But the real, where it really makes or breaks the project is with the local community, how you show up in those conversations and how you basically convince them and show them it has to be authentic. I think everybody has a very keen detector up if they sense, somebody's just playing them or somebody's really not being sincere or authentic. And so you really have to have a plan, right? Have a way you're going to support, like I think Meta committed to 500 jobs in that project in Northeast Louisiana. If the question, okay, as AI starts to be able to run a lot of those data centers without people, are you going to, what are you going to do with that 500? Are you going to keep it there? Are you going to get a 400, 300? Maybe we'll, how do you, let's hope they don't find out, how do you deal with that? How do you answer that question? Let's say we really only need 100 or maybe 50 people in the data center. AI does the rest. How are we going to compensate for that? Because as soon as you say one thing and do another, or show any sense of insincerity, or that you're really not being truthful, you're trying to hide something, then it takes like that quick to lose your credibility. And you see it all the time with corporations and in their local communities. So you really have to go in with the mindset of we're going to be shoot straight with these people and deal with the hard questions, speak truth, and not try to spin it in any way.
I agree. It also seems like, if you're working for a business where you're very used to making sort of the cold clinical business case and not really concerning yourself with the emotional aspects of where people might be coming from, or with, the values that they bring to the table, their fears with regard to the development of this new infrastructure, being sensitive and positioning yourself so that and also understanding very deeply the different stakeholder groups that you're dealing with and how they view a project like this differently. It just seems like there's a lot of soft skills entailed in trying to navigate this kind of project that's sort of at odds with the you know billions and billions of dollars that need to be that need to be invested to make the economic case make sense.
The rub you really have to, you're already out of your comfort zone being, in a culture, usually in a conversation that you're not accustomed to, that you're not, people in Silicon Valley that talk about these, they have their terminology, right? And how they say things. And so, I would practice that when I would go into a local rural community, spend hours practicing. Okay, what do I not say? What are the red flags? What are the words and phrases that I could use as a expat and I live in the big city? Many of them haven't even been to the big city. So then you have to really spend a lot of time in sort of really anchoring yourself in the culture and what's important to them and how can you speak in a way that resonates with them and be sincere about it. And really, at the end of the day, is this somebody that's just doing a flyby and just going to come in and tell me what I want to hear, and then I'll never see him again. I won't, when he said what he says doesn't happen, where do I find that guy, right? Did he leave me with his card, with his cell phone number? See ya, maybe bought us some. I'll never forget. We did a project up in the very high Andes Mountains, right on the equator, very very remote community, and so we were doing some dams up there at the 16, 15, 14,000 feet, and there was a lot of resistance initially to the project, and they were concerned about their agricultural irrigation. So we cut a deal with the community, and we committed to doing some projects for them. Fix a bridge, put electricity in the school, fix the roof on the school, and we had like 7 or 8 projects, and we did every single one of those projects. We did what we said we were going to do, and then we had the celebration afterward. And the local head of the local community, when I met him and talked to him, he said, "I'm not sure who you are, but I hope more people like you come here." I said, Why do you say that?" "'Cause you're the first people that actually did what you said you were going to do. You finished those projects, and our bridge is fixed. Our kids can go to school with electricity, and they don't have the elements coming in at them as they're at school." So, well, we said, yeah, that seems obvious to me, but for him, so that kind of, having that kind of a story of these people do what they say what they're, do what they say they're going to do. They're not BSing or trying to, is really, I think will be important and not something people, focus on normally.
And one of the concerns that I can imagine a lot of communities are thinking about is that their energy costs are going to go up. To your point about property taxes, maybe the economy gets better, but the economy pushes them out. It leaves them behind. So how do you sort of respond to objections like that from a community?
Yeah, well, you have to. So that's right. Prices like in Microsoft and Anthropic said, "Hey, we'll foot that bill." It's not so easy to calculate exactly how much is their impact of their project. It's a complicated math there, but having that commitment, I think, hey, we'll make sure that we pay that any incremental difference from our project. And then on things like job, I mean, training, you have to sit down with the community and understand their fears. What are you afraid of? Well, when this trade thing years ago, they told they're going to tell you what happened back in the 80s and 90s when they were promised that global trade would help bring them make their factories bigger, better, more demand, and it didn't happen. And many of them were left with empty buildings, right, where their factories used to be. So they're wary. This is not their first rodeo. So they come into it with kind of a yeah. We know we've heard this before, right? And so you really have to sit down with them and understand their fears. And let's talk about, we'll commit to training, committing some of the X amount of the, profits, or, to training you and your, setting up, building a school that will help, that kind of thing, where you hear, what are you afraid of? What are your real fears? What makes you pause or even reject this type of a project? And look at those as legitimate, and try to walk in their shoes, if you will. I can understand that. That makes sense why you would be afraid of that. So here's what we can, how does this sound? If we commit to this, will this help you feel better about it? Just really trying to address those fears, because, in the case at South Bend, they didn't. They were just talking about this kind of generic, the future, and it's more, just sort of generic positive things out there. But they went, okay, in this community, with these people, here's what we're going to do, very specific and direct to, their kids, their grandkids, their neighbors, people that they know. How are you going to, so yeah, you really have to sit down and spend some time, and your people, spend some time with them and really work that out.
Yeah, and as I'm hearing you talk, one of the things that's occurring to me is that you mentioned NIMBYism, not in my backyard. There's it's sort of an umbrella term that describes like a bucket of fears that people might have. Some people are worried about the noise. Some people are worried about the cost. Some people are worried about the. Some people are just angry about what happened with trade historically, and they think this is just going to be a replay of it. Other people are just mistrustful of anyone who comes who comes from California to visit them. And so there's a long list of objections that people that people in a given community might have. And what the hyperscalers are doing is either trying to navigate that, or in the case of building their own energy infrastructure, they're trying to avoid having to navigate that by sort of co-locating the energy infrastructure with the data center. So, I can you just help me understand, do you think that doing the shadow power grid thing of building your own data generation capacity along with the data center, do you view this as a long-term solution, or more of a short-term band-aid that these companies are doing in order to move more quickly, in order to avoid having to have the hard conversations with the regulators that they might have to have otherwise?
Well, you still have to have some conversation with regulators, and it's not as the same, because you're not using the power from the existing grid. You're building your own, but you still have permits and licenses and whatnot you have to get. But it changes the conversation, and this has been happening for decades. So they're not the first ones that have the first industry that has come in and built inside the fence, they used to call it. And so it's a very long established way of dealing with this issue. And so it's I would say it's going to be an option into the future. It's not a band-aid, I don't think. The difference is, the utility is, that's their expertise, not yours. And so, but when you build an inside, that you have to either hire someone to manage that for you, it's basically something you would normally outsource, to the utility. I just want to have my power when I need it, and I don't want to worry about where it comes from, or if it's needs maintenance, or whatever. It's like, but then all of a sudden, that's your problem, because that's your power source. And so, like in Google's case, to have this, forget the name of the company, in whatever it is, but yeah, they acquired. Well, they're acquiring that expertise, and so then it's in house. But it's $5 billion, right? It wasn't a small acquisition. Maybe for Google it is, but you have that challenge of something you've always outsourced. All of a sudden, now if you're going to build it inside the fence, now it's in house. Now you have to hire somebody or hire people to manage that for you and deal with the issues of owning and operating a little power plant. And so then it's something that, if it goes down, because they never want it to go down. They want backup to the backup to the backup to the backup, which isn't, in many cases, at some point you're going to have an outage. But it's a different model. And I think they would much prefer, like in Meta's case, that's Entergy is the local utility. They're building and owning and operating the power plants. So it's not Meta's headache. They just, you guys deliver us the power, and we'll that's on you, not on us. Whereas, I think that's the preferred way if they can do that. 'Cause they don't want to, nobody wants to have something in house that isn't their core strength, isn't their core skill set. So then you have a whole new set of headaches and, issues you're not accustomed to, and you don't know how to deal with them. And so that's the challenge of bringing it, inside the fence or behind the meter, if you will. And, some companies have done that very successfully. Others have not. They end up selling it back to the utility and letting the utility, take that asset of that plant. And so there are different, success stories and stories that didn't work out so well. So it's because I think at the end of the day, for them, they don't even think the cost of the power is a big issue. It's just they need that power 24/7, 365, so that they can have their chat bot or their, the Claude or OpenAI or whatever running, without any issues.
Yeah, and it just strikes me that because of the market dynamics that they find themselves in, you've got this fast-growing use case that's energy intensive that also seems to competitive advantage seems to be based on scale, the scale of compute that you can bring to bear, but then also it seems to be sort of a winner-take-all marketplace where people will migrate to the company that has the best AI capabilities, and so just all of the incentives are to move as quickly as they can. So the market dynamics are causing them to look a lot harder at vertical integration, like Standard Oil, like the Ford Motor Company. It was whoever got to scale first won, and so they were going to get to the highest degree of scale they possibly could. And so just it's a it's a fascinating time also because the number of players who can put these resources to bear, who can bring these resources to bear, is also very high. And it, relatively speaking, and so this, from a consumer perspective and a business perspective, I mean, switching between any of these model companies is relatively easy, and so it sort of the protections that you would normally hope to secure when making this scale of investment in energy infrastructure, in data centers, it's hard to forecast what demand is going to look like for AI, and it's hard to forecast what energy infrastructure needs to look like. And, I think the utility companies, if they could forecast energy demand really well, they would build it themselves, but they don't want to be stuck sort of holding the bag for building out capacity that doesn't end up being used.
Right, right. Well, it's funny you mentioned that vertical integration, and I remember Ford actually had a rubber plantation in Brazil way back when. This is in, I think, the 20s and 30s. Where they were trying to get rubber for the tires. And so this isn't the first time we've had this type of challenge. When we have these big new technologies that come on, you have these types of and I think that at the end of the day, the people who really are clear-headed and really able to see it, maybe with some being grounded in reality, and really do their homework, and adjust and pivot when it calls for that, not get stuck in a certain mindset that, I think that's what happened in South Bend is, well, of course, this is going to happen, right? This has to happen. This is AI, and it was, I think, voted down 4-1, or it wasn't even close. And so, people, all those negative mindsets and fears and anxieties that weren't addressed and just sort of papered over with, well, this is the future. We can't miss out on it. We have to be a part of it, or it's going to leave us behind. And I'll probably have some truth to all of those, but everybody said, well, look, we're not signing up for this. So, it's interesting and challenging, and the companies that make the right choices and have the right people to help them, because this is right now, this is way out of their normal skill set, way beyond their typical, what they're focused on. And so it's really hard to make that, get up that learning curve and do it right. You're going to make some mistakes. So you obviously got to learn from your mistakes quickly. When they have that fail fast mentality, they're going to be fail early, fail fast. They're going to be that mantra is going to be put to the test, or is being put to the test here.
Yeah, it seems like a difficult arena in which to fail fast. Mickey, I really appreciate you coming out today. As we head toward the end, we normally do a segment where we just spend a minute stepping back and talking about, what's one big idea that's on your mind. So if there's something that comes to mind for you, it can be related to this conversation or unrelated to this conversation. Happy to open the floor for you to share the big idea that's been there for you.
Well, the thing I'm a Vistage Chair, as you said, and so all this fear of AI, and who needs humans anymore, right? The big idea is that the ability to work with people, to lead people, to be a good teammate, to add value, that's never going to go away, and that's never going to be. There's going to be a need for that, and I think that's the idea. Is don't just continue to grow, continue to learn, continue to challenge yourself, and you're going to be okay. But that fear of being replaced by AI, I'm not afraid. I'm not afraid. I guess that's the big idea. I'm not afraid. I'm gonna, what I do, and they're, whether it's OpenAI or Claude or whatever, it's I'm not going to be replaced, and really make yourself irreplaceable in that sense of just how do I continue to add value and train and learn and evolve.
Yeah, I love that. And also, that relates to the idea that I've been chewing a lot lately. This week, one of the big news stories was that Jack, the former CEO of Twitter, who is now the CEO of Block, laid off 40% of his workforce, almost all software engineers, and sort of used AI as the reason for why the layoffs occurred. And it caused a lot of conversation, obviously, because if you're a software engineer, you're looking around, and now a CEO has gone out and said publicly that he thinks that a lot of CEOs are going to be cutting a lot of staff because of the additional efficiencies that AI can drive. And so, to your point about fear, that can cause a lot of fear and anxiety among people who see the potential for this automation to come through. And where I come down is, it's easy to see the headlines of people who are cutting large quantities of staff, but what you don't see is the hundreds of thousands of small companies across the country that have the opportunity to build capabilities using AI that they didn't have the capacity to build yesterday, that have the ability to automate things that they didn't have the capacity to automate yesterday. And so the new demand and the new capabilities, it's a slow trickle, and it doesn't make as many headlines, and it takes a long time to show up in the productivity statistics. But the big cuts that cause fear, they happen all at once, where everybody can see it. And so, I don't think any of us knows where what the long-term economic impacts of AI are going to be. But what I do think is that we need to try to have a more nuanced view of where this might shake out, and acknowledge that, to your point, Mickey, everybody's going to have to grow and change and adapt to the economy in the same way that we have historically as new technology has become available. But that doesn't mean that we're all out of a job. It just means that we have to keep learning, keep growing, and keep our eye on the ways that we can add value given our particular skills.
Right. It was funny because that was Jack Dorsey, who's supposed to be the kinder, gentler, when he was at Twitter, and Elon came in, and now he's the bad guy. He's kind of evolved, I guess, as well.
Yeah, well, everybody, if you're going to be a public figure now, then you always have to be ready to turn heel. You've got to be always got to be ready to rise and ready to fall. Well, Mickey, I want to be sensitive to your time. I really appreciate you coming on. So thank you so much.
You're welcome.
That's it for this episode of Eventual Consistency. If you want to talk about your data challenges, or you think we got something wrong and want to tell us how, you can find us at Cordon.com. That's CORRDYN.com. We're doing this every 2 weeks, so we'll see you next time, where maybe we'll be a touch more consistent. Thanks for listening.